Before the name on the page ever became a name on a map, it was mud, salt hay, and a dike wall holding back the Bay of Fundy tide. Grand-Pré, 1754. The marshland glows green under a low sky, reclaimed acre by acre from the sea by families who had been building these dikes for 4 generations. Roughly 9,000 people live scattered across this stretch of what is now Nova Scotia, farming land no other European settler wanted, raising cattle on ground the French crown had mostly forgotten about, speaking a French dialect that had already begun to drift from the one spoken in Paris. They call themselves Acadians. The English call them the French neutrals, because for 40 years these families have refused to swear an oath of loyalty to a crown they did not choose and a war they did not start. That refusal is about to cost them everything. Within a year, this same field will be empty. The people who worked it will be scattered across 2 continents, and the names they carried out of that scattering are the names 14 families in Louisiana still carry today, on porches, on mailboxes, on gravestones in parish cemeteries 1,000 miles from the marsh where they began. Some of those names will end up on a wall in a small Louisiana church town, carved in stone, listed among roughly 3,000 refugees who found their way here after the longest and most disorienting decade any of them ever lived through. Some will end up anglicized beyond recognition, sitting quietly inside American families who have no idea where the letters originally came from. And some will end up carrying a history so different from what the family always assumed that the paper record itself starts to look like a decoy. So if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What happened to Grand-Pré and to the 20 or so other Acadian settlements strung along the Fundy marshes has a name history did not always want to give it: Le Grand Dérangement, the Great Upheaval. In September of 1755, Charles Lawrence, the British Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, ran out of patience with a population he had never trusted. Acadia had changed hands from France to Britain more than 40 years earlier under the Treaty of Utrecht, but the Acadians who stayed had never fully accepted what that meant. They wanted to keep their Catholic faith, protected from a Protestant crown. They wanted assurance they would never be forced to take up arms against France or against their Mi'kmaq neighbors, who had lived beside them for a century without conflict. Successive governors had tolerated this uneasy neutrality. Lawrence did not. At Grand-Pré, the trap was simple, and it worked. British officer John Winslow summoned the men and older boys of the parish to the church, telling them it concerned the return of firearms confiscated earlier that year. More than 400 men walked into that building, believing they were attending a routine meeting. The doors were sealed behind them. Outside, soldiers moved through the settlement, rounding up the women, the children, and the old, setting fire to homes, barns, and the dikes themselves, so there would be nothing left to return to. Similar operations played out at Chignecto, at Annapolis Royal, at Pisiquid, across the colony that same season. The ships went out that autumn loaded past capacity, and where they went was decided less by any coherent plan than by which colonial governor happened to have room. Roughly 300 Acadians landed in New York, about 2,000 were unloaded in Massachusetts, 500 went to Pennsylvania, 700 to Connecticut, 1,200 to Virginia, 1,000 to Maryland, 500 to South Carolina, 400 to Georgia. None of these colonies had asked for them, and several, Virginia most notably, refused to let the ships unload at all and rerouted them again, this time across the Atlantic to England, where the exiles were held in prison hulks and coastal towns until the war ended nearly a decade later. Others were shipped directly to France. Still others ended up in the Caribbean, in the sugar colony of Saint-Domingue, on islands that had never seen a French-speaking farmer from a saltwater marsh in their life. Families were separated on the wharves as a matter of routine, not accident. Husbands were loaded onto one ship, wives and children onto another, the vessels assigned to different colonies with no plan for reunification. Disease moved through the packed holds. By the time the deportation wound down in 1764, out of an Acadian population, historians place between 13,000 and 18,000, something between 1/3 and 1/2 had died, from shipwreck, from smallpox, from starvation, from the sheer accumulated toll of a decade with no fixed home. Modern historians, including the scholars behind the Acadian entries at 64 parishes, now describe the expulsion using a word the 18th century did not have and would not have used about itself: a deliberate campaign of ethnic cleansing, aimed not just at removing a population from a piece of land, but at erasing it as a distinct people. Out of that scattering, one particular current eventually bent toward Louisiana, a colony that had passed from French to Spanish hands in 1762 and needed settlers Spain could trust to hold a border against British territory. The first small group, barely 20 people, arrived in April of 1764, having slipped out of a New York jail and made their way south by whatever means they could find. A larger wave followed in February of 1765, 193 exiles, led by a militia captain the British had spent a decade trying and failing to kill. And 20 years later, in 1785, came the largest single movement of the whole story. 7 ships, chartered by the Spanish crown, carrying nearly 1,600 Acadians directly from the French port of Nantes to the mouth of the Mississippi. The names on those passenger manifests, on those militia rolls, on the wall inside a small heritage museum in St. Martinville, Louisiana, are the same names carried by roughly 500,000 people living in South Louisiana today. 14 of them carry the story especially clearly. Broussard. Begin with the one that never went quiet. Joseph Broussard was born in Port Royal in 1702, and by the time the deportation began, he was already the closest thing Acadia had to a resistance commander. They called him Beau Soleil, beautiful sun, and for the better part of a decade he ran a guerrilla campaign from the Petit Kodiak River, raiding British supply convoys and coastal settlements alongside Mi'kmaq allies, at one point commanding a captured privateering vessel against British shipping in the Bay of Fundy. The British caught him twice. The first time, in 1755, they deported him to Charleston, and he made his way back to Acadia and resumed fighting. The second time, in 1760, after his men were finally starved into surrender, they held him in Halifax until the Treaty of Paris ended the war in 1763. He was 62 years old when he finally led a column of Acadian exiles out of Halifax, first to the French colony of Saint-Domingue, then north to New Orleans, arriving in February of 1765 with 193 people behind him. The Spanish government made him militia captain of the Attakapas district that same spring. He died a few months later, buried near what is now the town of Broussard, Louisiana, a few miles south of Lafayette, carrying his name into the 21st century as a town on a map instead of just a family on a passenger list. His descendants scattered through the bayous of South Louisiana over the following 2.5 centuries, and family genealogists have traced one particular line forward through the parish records into the 20th century, arriving eventually at Celestine Bayinse, and through her, 2 granddaughters raised in Houston named Beyoncé and Solange. Whatever else changes across 260 years and one international border, the surname on the militia roll in 1765 and the surname behind 2 of the most recognized voices in American music trace back to the same man standing in a church doorway in Grand-Pré, refusing to be taken quietly. LeBlanc, the white one from the Old French blanc, most likely a nickname for pale hair or a fair complexion, though in parts of southern France the name was sometimes given to foundlings with no other family to claim. It hardly matters which explanation applies to any one LeBlanc line, because by the time of the expulsion the name had already become the single most common surname in Acadia, present in nearly every settlement from Port Royal to Grand-Pré to Chignecto. LeBlanc families were swept into the deportation in every wave, sent to Massachusetts, to Maryland, to Connecticut, to England, to France, scattered as thoroughly as any name on this list. Some of those LeBlancs found each other again in Louisiana, others didn't, or found their name changed for them along the way. Because LeBlanc translates directly into English as white, some LeBlanc families who ended up in English-speaking colonies or English-run prisons had their surname quietly converted on the paperwork, not through any organized campaign, but through the ordinary carelessness of a colonial clerk who preferred writing a word he understood. A LeBlanc entering an English record might leave it as a white, the same family, the same bloodline, filed under a different word for the same color. If your family has always been white and has always told a story about French ancestors nobody could quite explain, the paperwork might be hiding exactly what it looks like it's hiding: Landry. This one goes back further than Acadia itself, to the Germanic personal name Landric, built from land, meaning land, and Ric, meaning powerful or ruler. It arrived in France centuries before it arrived in the New World, carried by Norman families into the French countryside, and from there into the first generation of colonists who crossed to Port Royal in the 1600s. Landry families were among the earliest and most numerous in the whole Acadian settlement, farmers primarily, working the same reclaimed marshland that supported Broussards and Leblancs and Héberts, intermarrying with those same families so consistently that by the 1750s, tracing a single Acadian genealogical line without hitting a Landry within 2 or 3 generations is close to impossible. That density is exactly what makes the name useful to a genealogist and frustrating to anyone trying to draw a clean line back to one specific ancestor. The Acadian Memorial in St. Martinville lists Landry among its most repeated surnames on the wall of refugees who reached Louisiana between 1764 and 1788, not because one Landry family made the journey, but because dozens of unrelated or distantly related Landry households did, independently, arriving on different ships in different decades, each carrying the same name into the same stretch of bayou country. Hébert, a Germanic compound as well, from Harry, meaning army, and Bert, meaning bright or famous. Put together, it means something close to brilliant warrior, a name that crossed into northern France long before the Norman conquest of 1066 carried it into England, and long before French colonists carried it across the Atlantic into Acadia in the 1600s. Today it holds a specific distinction inside Cajun genealogy. Hébert is the single most common surname among Louisiana's Cajun population, more prevalent even than Broussard or Landry, appearing on the Acadian Memorial's Wall of Names, in the 1765 militia rolls under Beausoleil Broussard, and in the 1785 passenger manifests of the 7 ships out of Nantes. The density of the name across every wave of the migration, the early deportation ships, the Halifax prisoner exchanges, the Saint-Domingue detour, and the final Spanish-funded crossing from France, means that most Héberts in Louisiana today cannot trace their line to a single point of entry, the way a Broussard family can point to Beausoleil. Instead, the name arrived from multiple directions at once, different branches of the same original Acadian family converging on the same stretch of the Bayou Teche and the Atakapas Prairie from at least 3 separate migration routes, sometimes without any of those branches knowing the others had made the same crossing by a different road. Thibodeau, spelled a dozen different ways across 3 centuries of records, Thibodeau, Thibodeau, Thibaut, Thibodeau, all descending from the medieval French personal name Thibaut, itself a French rendering of the Germanic Theobald, meaning bold people. Pierre Thibodeau was among the founding generation of Acadian settlers, arriving from the Poitou region of France in the 1650s, and later helping to found the settlement at Chignecto, one of the string of Fundy marsh communities that would be emptied a century later. By the time of the expulsion, Thibodeau households were established across nearly every Acadian parish, and the family's later history in Louisiana followed a slightly different arc than most of the names on this list. Rather than concentrating in a single parish, Thibodeau families spread widely enough that the name gave itself to an entire Louisiana town, Thibodaux, seat of Lafourche Parish, still standing today along the bayou the 1785 exiles were funneled toward when they stepped off the ships from Nantes. Few Acadian surnames have made that particular leap, from a family name carried in exile to a town name printed on a state highway sign, still guiding drivers south of Baton Rouge toward the bayou country the family helped settle, Melançon. And here the record does something none of the other names on this list do. It contradicts itself. Every Melançon, or Melanson, in Acadian Louisiana descends from 2 brothers, Charles and Pierre, who arrived at Port Royal in the 1650s and became founding settlers of the Grand-Pré region. For generations, the family understood itself as thoroughly, unambiguously French, one of the oldest and most Catholic lines in all of Acadia. The paper record tells a different story. Baptismal and notarial documents place the brothers' arrival not from France but from England, aboard a ship called the Satisfaction, sailing with the newly appointed English governor of Acadia in 1657. Their father, according to the surviving contracts and the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, was a French Huguenot named Pierre, known by the nickname La Verdure, who had fled Catholic persecution in France for Protestant England sometime before 1632. Their mother, a woman named Priscilla, was English by birth, a fact the biographical record treats as settled, and which generations of Melançon descendants have quietly resisted, insisting instead, without documentary support, that she was Scottish. Charles Melançon renounced Protestantism in 1664, the same year he married into the Catholic Dugas family of Port Royal, and from that conversion forward the family's outward identity as Catholic, French, and Acadian was never again questioned inside the community. But the paper trail underneath that identity, the ship's manifest, the notarial record calling him Sieur de la Ramée, his brother's own alias, La Verdure, a name that turns up attached to at least one other Acadian family with the same pattern of a concealed origin, tells a quieter story about a Protestant refugee family that converted, intermarried, and became so completely Acadian within 2 generations that the English mother and the Huguenot father simply stopped being part of what the family told itself it was. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one, Boudreaux. The family traces to Michel Boudreaux, who arrived in Acadia from the Poitou region of France sometime before 1640 and became one of the colony's earliest civil officials, serving for years as a judge and later as deputy governor at Port Royal. His descendants multiplied quickly enough that Boudreaux, later standardized in Louisiana as Boudreaux, appears among the founding surnames tracked by Acadian genealogists as one of the handful of families present at nearly every stage of the colony's early growth. The Boudreaux line crossed into the Melançon story directly. Abraham Boudreaux, an Acadian ship captain and trader, married Cécile Melançon, daughter of the Huguenot-descended Charles, sometime before the turn of the 1700s, binding 2 of Acadia's most prolific families together, 2 generations before either of them had any idea the British were coming for all of them at once. By the time of the 1785 migration from Nantes, Boudreaux households were aboard multiple ships in the fleet, resettling primarily along Bayou Lafourche, and the name remains one of the most recognizable in South Louisiana today, carried by musicians, politicians, and shrimpers in roughly equal measure. Richard, a name so common across French-speaking Europe that it carries almost no information on its own, meaning powerful ruler, a Germanic compound like Landry and Hébert before it. What makes the Acadian Richard line traceable is not the name but the company it kept. Pierre Richard was the first cousin of Beausoleil Broussard himself, and he was among the party that accompanied Broussard out of Halifax, through Saint-Domingue, and into New Orleans in February of 1765, one of the earliest Acadian families to set foot in Louisiana at all. The Richard name also appears with unusual frequency aboard the 1785 ships out of Nantes. 6 of the 7 vessels in that fleet carried at least one Richard family, more than any other surname aboard the fleet, and 3 sisters, Marie, Marguerite, and Elizabeth Richard, crossed together on a single vessel called the Saint-Remy. Among the descendants of this widely scattered Acadian Richard line is the singer and poet Zachary Richard, whose music has spent 4 decades trying to put back into words the exact history this video is describing: the marsh, the ships, the 2 centuries of a name traveling farther than anyone who first carried it could have imagined. Arsenault, also recorded as Arsenault in Canadian records, an early Poitou region family whose Acadian line begins with settlers established at Port Royal by the 1680s. Like most of the names on this list, Arsenault households were scattered across every wave of the deportation, and the family's later history in Louisiana runs directly through one of the most famous and most fictionalized love stories to come out of the entire expulsion. In 1847, the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow published Evangeline, a narrative poem about 2 Acadian lovers torn apart during the deportation, a story that became, for millions of readers who never learned another detail about Acadian history, the only version of this event they ever heard. Longfellow's characters were fiction, but St. Martinville, Louisiana has spent more than a century insisting the story had real roots in the community, and local tradition names the real-life couple behind the legend as Emmeline Labiche and Louis Arsenault, reunited, according to that tradition, not in Philadelphia as the poem claims, but under a live oak tree on the banks of Bayou Teche, where the tree still stands today, and where Emmeline is said to be buried in the small cemetery behind St. Martin de Tours Catholic Church. Whether or not the specific couple existed exactly as local memory preserved them, the Arsenault name attached itself permanently to the most widely known Acadian story ever told, fictional frame and all, Comeau. Recorded in the earliest Acadian census as Comeau, one of the founding surnames present at Port Royal from the earliest years of French settlement in the 1630s, decades before Grand-Pré existed as a community at all. The Comeau line branched early and widely enough that by the time of the expulsion, family clusters carrying the name were established in nearly every major Acadian settlement, from Port Royal itself to Chignecto to the outlying communities on the Île de la Madeleine. That early wide distribution meant Como households were deported through nearly every channel the British used, sent to New England ports, to Virginia, to England, and eventually finding their way to Louisiana across multiple separate migrations spanning more than 2 decades. Genealogists working the Acadian memorials records note that Comeau family clusters in Louisiana today often show origins from 2 or 3 entirely separate Acadian communities, evidence not of one family's crossing but of several distantly related Comeau branches making the same trip independently, sometimes generations apart, converging by coincidence on the same stretch of bayou. Douce, from the Old French doux, meaning sweet or gentle, likely a nickname passed down through a founding ancestor whose temperament, real or exaggerated, outlived him by 3 centuries. The name's most prominent early bearer was Germain Douce, who served as a military commander at Port Royal in the 1640s, notable enough in the colony's early records to have his own alias attached, de la Verdure, the same alias pattern that turns up attached to the Melançon founders a generation later, a naming convention Acadian genealogists still use today to untangle which unrelated families happen to share a nickname. Douce descendants were present across the deportation in the same scattered pattern as most large Acadian families, and the name also appears among the passengers of the 1785 fleet from Nantes, aboard at least 2 of the 7 ships, families that had spent 30 years in France after the expulsion, before finally completing the crossing, their Port Royal ancestors never anticipated having to make. The surname survives today throughout South Louisiana with enough regional spelling variation, Doucet, Doucette, Ducey, that tracing a single line back to Germain's original household usually requires cross-referencing baptismal records across at least 3 parishes and 2 centuries of inconsistent spelling. Robichaud. Originally Robichaud, a patronymic surname built on the personal name Robert, one of the more straightforward name origins on this list, but no less rooted in the Acadian founding generation for it. The family established itself early in the Port Royal settlement, and by the 1750s, Robichaud households were spread widely enough across the Fundy Marsh communities to be caught in nearly every wave of the deportation. Robichaud families reunited in Louisiana slowly, arriving through the same scattered pattern as most of the names here, some through the early 1760s migrations out of the eastern seaboard colonies, others aboard the 1785 fleet from France. Today the name is concentrated most heavily along Bayou Lafourche and in the Acadiana parishes surrounding Lafayette, spelled with the same regional pronunciation shift that turned Boudreaux into Boudreaux and Comeau into Comeau, the added X a Louisiana-specific spelling convention that has nothing to do with the original French and everything to do with how the name was recorded, generation after generation, by clerks working in a language that had never quite settled on how to write it down. Trahan, one of the oldest documented Acadian family names, tracing to Guillaume Trahan, a surgeon who settled at Port Royal in the 1630s, making the Trahan line contemporaries of the Comeaus among the very first French families established in Acadia. Trahan households multiplied across the following century into one of the larger surname groups in the colony, present at Grand-Pré, at Pisiquid, and at several of the smaller marsh settlements by the time of the expulsion. The family's deportation followed the same fractured pattern as nearly every large Acadian surname group, split across multiple colonies and countries with no coordination and no expectation of reunion. What distinguishes the Trahan resettlement in Louisiana is less the crossing than the destination. Family clusters concentrated heavily in the Acadian coast parishes along the Mississippi north of New Orleans, one of the earliest and most stable of the post-war Acadian settlements, where Trahan households remain thickly represented in parish records today, more than 2.5 centuries after Guillaume first stepped off a ship at Port Royal. Guidry, descended from Claude Guidry, known in the records by the layered nickname Guidry dit Grivois de la Verdure, present in the Acadian census by 1698. The name traces further back to a Germanic personal name built on the root Wido, meaning hunt, making Guidry one of the only names on this list whose meaning has nothing to do with land, warfare, or color, and everything to do with the pursuit of something. Guidry households were established widely enough by the 1750s to be caught across the deportation in the same scattered pattern as the rest of this list, and the family's later concentration in Louisiana runs heavily through the prairie parishes west of Lafayette, Acadia Parish itself among them, ground the family had never seen before 1765 and has not left since. The dit Laverdure portion of Claude Guidry's recorded alias links his family, at least in nickname if not in blood, to the same naming pattern carried by both the Douce and Melançon founders, a small detail that reminds anyone tracing these 14 names how tightly interwoven Acadia's founding families were, before a single deportation order tried to erase the distinction between all of them at once. 14 names, one deportation, and one long, uneven current that eventually pulled scattered branches of all of them into the same stretch of Louisiana bayou country. Paper records and passenger manifests only tell you where people went. They don't tell you what survived inside them once they got there, and that part of the story belongs less to history than to genetics, beginning in the 1600s and continuing straight through the deportation and the Louisiana resettlement that followed it. The Acadian population passed through what geneticists call a founder effect, not once but twice. The first bottleneck happened when Acadia was originally settled by a comparatively small number of French families, somewhere in the range of 50 households before 1650, whose descendants intermarried within a tight and geographically isolated community for more than a century. The second bottleneck happened after 1755, when the population that survived deportation, disease, and 2 decades of scattering across 4 continents reassembled itself in South Louisiana into an even smaller, even more isolated founding group, one that continued marrying within itself along the bayous for another 2 centuries. That double bottleneck left a genetic signature researchers have been studying since the 1980s, when geneticist Branya Keats and her colleagues at the LSU Health Sciences Center in New Orleans began investigating why certain hereditary conditions kept turning up in Cajun families at rates far above the national average. Friedreich's ataxia, Usher syndrome, Tay-Sachs disease, a rare kidney and lung disorder now known as the Acadian variant of Fanconi syndrome, found almost nowhere else in the world outside families tracing directly back to Acadia. One 1999 presentation by researchers involved in the project put a number on it directly, describing risks for some of these conditions among Acadian-descended people as running anywhere from 35 to 250% higher than the national average. Researchers studying the population that stayed behind in New Brunswick, or eventually returned to Canada, have since found the same pattern of elevated hereditary carrier rates on that side of the story too, evidence that the founder effect took hold on both halves of the divided population independently, in Nova Scotia and in Louisiana, marking the DNA of a people the 18th century tried to erase with a signature no deportation order could touch. None of this shows up on a standard commercial DNA test the way Ashkenazi or Sephardic ancestry does, because Acadian and Cajun heritage was never treated as one of the major reference populations testing companies built their algorithms around. What a Cajun-descended person is more likely to see instead is an unusually concentrated cluster of French matches, second and third cousins by the dozen, all tracing back to the same handful of Fundy Marsh villages, the same 14 names, and a few dozen others repeating themselves across every branch of the tree with a density that ordinary French ancestry does not produce. It is a signature written less in a percentage than in a pattern, the same names appearing again and again, generation after generation, refusing along with the people who carried them to be broken apart as thoroughly as the deportation order intended. The wall inside the Acadian Memorial in St. Martinville holds roughly 3,000 of those names today, etched into stone behind St. Martin de Tours Catholic Church, a few dozen yards from the Evangeline Oak, and the grave locals still visit believing it holds Emmeline Labiche. Visitors walk that wall looking for one name among 3,000, and more often than not, they find it. Broussard is there, Leblanc is there, Landry, Hébert, Thibodeau, Melançon, Boudreau, Richard, Arsenault, Comeau, Doucet, Robichaud, Tréhan, and Guidry, all 14, carved into the same stone, carried out of the same marshland, scattered across the same ocean, and settled, against every intention the deportation order ever had, along the same bayou 260 years later. If one of those 14 names is sitting in your family tree right now, the paper trail behind it runs from a dike wall on the Bay of Fundy, through a locked church door, across an ocean in a ship's hold, and into a wall of names in a small Louisiana town most of the country has never heard of. The record was never destroyed. It was only ever scattered, waiting for someone to walk the wall and find it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.